I guess thinking about working with young people with depression, it is a really big area to think about, and I think therapists are doing a lot of things in a short space of time in a session, and trying to make it appear all quite seamless. But I think there is a lot that you're doing, and I think the sort of things that guide me in working effectively with young people with depression is really thinking about what the experience is like for them. I remember a long time ago, when I first started working in mental health, a social worker saying to me that if he could give the young people he worked with a good experience of accessing a mental health service, he felt like he'd done 90% of his job, because they were likely to return. And I think that stayed with me in my practice, is I want to make sure they have a good experience of coming to a mental health service. And so, you're approaching that young person, with respect, with care and compassion, and you are genuinely interested and curious about what is going on for them. And I think I'm always trying to work to try and understand the problem from their point of view and how they're seeing the difficulties that they're going through, rather than just sort of imposing my clinical understanding on them, but really listening to what they have to say and trying to make sense of that with them and work collaboratively with them.
Yeah. That's great. Let's just stop for a moment.
Yeah. As I started to work more and more with young people with depression, I felt that CBT wasn't always the appropriate mode of therapy for them. Just seeing how things continually kind of came back to relationships. For me, there was a pattern of this was all about relationships, and whether the relationships were impacting the depression or whether the depression was impacting people's or young people or anyone's ability to have supportive and understanding relationships in their lives, which can be that bit of a life jacket sometimes when people are really struggling, is those supports around them. So someone that I worked with suggested I read this book on interpersonal psychotherapy for adolescents. And it really spoke to me because it really did have a focus on relationships and patterns in relationships, and not just focusing on faulty or distorted thinking or thinking patterns, but how difficult relationships really can impact how we feel, and how we feel can really isolate us and reduce our ability to seek support. So I've been continuing to work with an IPT framework and develop my skills and be trained and supervised in IPT since reading that book. Yeah, so IPT is relationally focused and has a strong underpinning in attachment theory and looking at how people's attachment styles can influence their quality of their interpersonal relationships and how they respond to challenges in the world. IPT for adolescents focuses on 4 problem areas connected to the depression. So those are grief and loss, interpersonal dispute, a role transition, and interpersonal gaps. And each 4 of those becomes sort of a target area of the therapy as you work through that assessment stage of trying to identify where are we going to focus our attention on. You generally focus on one of those areas as being most closely related to the onset of the depression, not necessarily causing or caused by, but related in some way to the depressive symptoms. And then we're trying to do, the goal of therapy is to obviously reduce those symptoms or the impact of those symptoms, whilst increasing the social supports and sense of being supported for them. Yeah, so role play. Role play is one of the techniques you use for a couple of the problem areas. So in particular, interpersonal dispute or interpersonal gaps, you would use role play as a therapist to help the client get a real experiential understanding of communication, either their communication or the other person's communication, and really to analyse it together and see how that communication might be contributing to the difficulties that they're experiencing. And then you use role play and you swap roles, and you can be really creative with your roles. You can be the client can be the other person. You can try lots of different scenarios and responses, and it can help just get that real experiential understanding of how important communication is in quality relationships and getting support. In terms of risk, I think, whilst it's rare, it's certainly one of those things that should be in the back of your mind as a therapist when you're working with someone with depression, because it is a possibility. And so you're trying to assess and understand the risk and explore that risk within the safety of the therapeutic relationship, which I think is really important when we're trying to get a good picture of risk and a good understanding of risk. Is the quality of that therapeutic relationship is likely to improve how well you can assess that risk and how open the client can be with you. And so that therapeutic relationship is just so important in that person being able to open up about how they're feeling. And I think the thing to remember about the problem areas is sometimes they can seem really apparent, and then as we work through the phases of treatment, you can be flexible and open to perhaps we haven't quite nailed the problem area. I mean, remembering in assessment, you're sort of doing those first 3 sessions before you're developing the plan, and that's maybe 3 to 4 hours of you knowing a person. So it's not unusual for the plan to change, or to say, hey, actually, we thought it was perhaps grief, but I'm wondering if this is more about a role transition. And so, I think of a young person that I worked with whose parent had died, and the relationship had been a difficult relationship at the time of death, which complicated the grief. So it seemed like a really apparent thing. And she had come to me. Had seen another therapist previously, but had stopped working with that therapist because the therapist had insisted that it was grief. And she's saying it's not about the grief. It's not about the grief. And I thought, well, I'll hold that in the back of my mind, but I'll try to come to an understanding with her about what she sees the problem is. And as we worked through, it took a while for her to I think, really understand it herself. Yeah, so we got to a point where we understood that she had taken on the role of partner to the surviving parent in some ways, but also as a surrogate parent to a younger sibling. And as we unpacked what that meant for her and the impact on the relationships that she had with each of those, it was very much a role that she was not really prepared for, not necessarily a role that she didn't want, but very underprepared. And it did impact how she related to each of those and how she took on a number of problems that she was really not prepared or ready for her age and her development, and it had all just become a little bit too much. But there was this strong guilt but I should be there for them, that I really, I want to be there for them. I want to support them. And so we just worked through, psychoeducation is a really important part of IPT, and really sort of getting to know and understand why she might feel those obligations, why that might impact on her feeling depressed when you're taking on things that you're really not ready for. And so she learned a lot about herself without me really needing to recommend any particular thing that she should do. She was a very independent young person. And so once she was able to sort of understand, she could recognise where she needed to perhaps put in some boundaries and limits and communicate a bit more openly with those people to help them understand why it was hard for her. Yeah. So listening well is, I think that case that I just talked about really highlights the importance of listening really well from the client's perspective, how they are understanding the problem or how they're trying to make sense of the problem. And I think we underestimate the power of listening and the value of listening. We're often, I hear a lot of my colleagues talk about, that pressure to feel like you're doing things at times, or, I wish I had the right words, or what to say to a client who's in a distressing situation. And I think, I hear so many of the young people come through our service who tell me that, there's no one listens to them, or their parents don't listen to them, or no one's listening, or no one's understanding. And I think that we should really value listening, because we all want to feel like we've been listened to and understood, all of us. And young people, they've come from childhood, they're told, what to do, and then they're emerging young adults, and they're forming their own ideas about things, and we really need to listen and pay attention. And it's a great opportunity to build that therapeutic relationship. If you can be someone in their life who will really listen, then they will really talk.